All right, everyone, I have Liz Wolfe here, and I'm so excited to talk to her. She is I'm going to say it wrong. I'm going to butcher it already.
Nutritional Therapy Practitioner. I
Yeah.
stumble over that every time. It's a lot of
I was like, she's a
syllables.
nutrient something.
Something about, food.
um, and an author. And I love the title of your book, Just Eat the Yolks, that's in
hmm
there because I know for so long I did not.
Same
Um,
here.
and then I've been on this huge quest, if you follow me on Instagram, to find those rich colored egg yolks, and I finally found some that I like. But anyways, even though you're super into food, you can speak to so many different topics. But we're actually going to talk about safe sun exposure today, and I'm so excited. I didn't know, I'd never heard this term. When if I did, I'd been like, oh yeah, put on sunscreen.
hmm
And last year, I don't remember who it was, somewhere on Instagram, I saw somebody post something about safe sun exposure with their children. And I was like, oh my gosh, what a crazy concept. And so I started implementing that with my daughter. And I know so many people listening are like, what is that? It's not just putting on sunscreen. So we're here to cover
hmm
that topic. And I'm so excited that I found you on Instagram. Actually, you were referred to me by a listener. They're like, have Liz Wolfe come on and talk about this. So
Oh,
I'm
that's
so
so cool.
excited that you are here and to dive into this topic. So thank you for coming on the podcast.
Well, this is a really exciting connection. I was just actually, when I was getting ready to do this, I was listening to your podcast and I was listening to your episode with Dr. Stu, who
Mm-hmm.
I'm just like a huge fan of because I had a surprise breech birth with my
Oh, wow.
first. And I'm like, okay, well, maybe I should reach out to him and see if he'll come on the podcast. Sometimes you want to actually talk to people so you can talk your stuff through. So I would
Mm-hmm.
love to have Dr. Stu on and talk to him. I'm just like, I've got a bunch of your episodes in my queue to listen to. So this is just a really fun connection. And whoever recommended me to you, reach out to me on Instagram so I can say thanks.
Mhm. There was a couple I'd posted on there that I wanted to do an episode on this. And I'm like, I don't know who to talk to because I know I saw this somewhere. I don't
hmm
remember who posted it. I don't remember, where I heard it from.
Yeah,
So I'm like, send me who I should have on the podcast. And a couple of people sent your name.
that is so
So
cool.
I'm like, oh yeah. And so I was checking out your Instagram reel on it and all of that. So I'm
Yeah.
excited to talk about it. So I guess if somebody came to you and was like, safe sun exposure, what do
Yeah.
you think of?
So, all right. I like to be really nerdy about stuff like this. So I can give like literally a 2 minute, like, this is what you should do. But I feel like the whole point of like having a book or a podcast is to be able to actually really take people through like the how we got here type of
Mm-hmm.
stuff, because that's what you can give people a recommendation. But for me, and at least most of the people that I know, the next question is like, okay, why? Like,
Mm-hmm.
why isn't this ideal? Or why were we told to do something completely different for the last 30 years of my life or whatever it is? So I'll do how about I do like the very short version, and it's not going to feel controversial, and then we can like maybe like reverse engineer how we actually got there.
Yes.
So, safe sun exposure, right? That was the original question.
Mm-hmm.
Safe sun exposure. And this is actually in the scientific literature. I think this is something that the hippy dippy people like me have been kind of saying for a long time, that there is actually a way to safely expose your skin to the sun, and that it's worth doing, and that it is health promoting and not like this horrible, scary thing that's going to give you skin cancer. We've been saying it for a while, but what's interesting to me is it's now, I feel like these scientists are kind of like inching towards actually saying it and not feeling like they're going to lose their jobs for doing so. I was reading very recently, I did a podcast episode on sunscreen as well. And I was pulling from this 2021 scientific paper that literally said brief exposure to the sun at midday, which is what a lot of us think, like we should not be out in the sun between like 10 and 2. Avoid the
Mm-hmm.
hours of 10 and 2 because, you're just not going to be able to avoid these horrible rays. But midday exposure for 10, 15 minutes, or also depending on how melanated your skin is. So, how much melanin you actually have. Someone like me, Caucasian, olive skin, not super fair. I probably would burn more quickly than someone with more melanated skin. And so, there's kind of a gradient or a spectrum there for how long you want to be out in the sun. But this scientific paper actually said like 10 to 15 minutes at midday is probably health promoting and advisable for most people. And so that's sort of number one. And then from there, the question kind of pops up, well, then how do I protect myself? Unless you're, going outside for 15 minutes and then coming right back inside. And that's where things get a little bit more muddled, how to actually protect yourself from sun damage. And that's where I just get really, really nerdy. But the short answer is clothing. And there's a ton of new stuff that I just learned about sunscreen recently, about the FDA, about the approval process, about all of that stuff that I think we'll talk about, that really led me to say, I really think clothing, rash guards, hats, shade, parasols, and driving gloves. I don't know if we can bring those back, but I was saying on my podcast, we brought back fanny packs. So maybe we can bring back driving gloves and parasols, but really a physical barrier is superior to even zinc-based sunscreens. And I know people are really into safe sunscreens now, but there are some issues around that too, that you can just totally make irrelevant by just going for protective clothing.
Yeah. I remember that was something that I heard was 10 to 15 minutes and then long sleeves, shade, things like that. So somehow I was able to avoid most sunscreen last summer with my daughter, because we did swim lessons outside, but her swim lessons were 15 minutes and she wore a hat and she had the long sleeve swimming suit. So I didn't worry about it.
Did you do ISR? It's a little side note. Did you
no,
do
but
the
right now I am on a waiting list for it.
I need to do it.
My in-laws are getting a pool and I'm absolutely terrified. That's a whole other topic. I'm a very relaxed mom and I do not worry about a lot, but that is something that I am psycho about.
Yes.
And for good cause,
and for great cause. And we live at a lake, so I'm 100% in the same situation as you. And what I feel like is some swim lessons make them love the water, but don't make them safe in the water. So it's the first priority is make them safe in the water. And I feel like the only people that actually teach that is ISR.
Right.
Yeah. You'll have to let me know how that goes.
Well, because my oldest she'll be 2 September 1st. So, and then my youngest is 3.5 months. So I know that they don't start, the people that I went through or am on a list for, they don't start till 6 months. So, but I'll definitely let you know if hopefully we get in. Because otherwise I'm going to be on edge every time we're over there. But which, I mean, it's that time of year. You want your kids to have fun. You want them to be outside. You want them to enjoy the water. You want them to enjoy the sun. And the sun has so many benefits. So let's talk about that a little bit. One thing that I've been hearing so much, probably over the last year or two, just different podcasts that I've gotten into and trying to work on different health things, whether it's hormone or just health in general, is that exposing yourself to the sun as soon as you can when you wake up in the morning, which is still something that I'm not great at.
That's hard.
I think with kids, it's hard because I'm nursing both. And so I'm we're laying in bed, we're reading books, whatever, but we have to let the dog out. So usually we walk outside for a little bit and just the benefits of that. So I'd love to just kind of talk about, you were saying that there is so many benefits and we don't want to necessarily continually always shield ourselves from the sun. So what would be some of the benefits that we get from exposing our skin to the sun?
Well, every single cell in our bodies has vitamin D receptors. So, I mean, just number one, that's just sort of proof that this is an important substance. And I know a lot of people are like, well, I'm just going to supplement because I'm really worried about skin cancer or whatever. And we'll talk about that. But there are also, I think it's Dr. Michael Hollick, who is a big resource that I used for my book, and that was 8 years ago. So there's been a lot of stuff that has come out since then. But one of the things he talks about is photoproducts. So photoproducts being the wide range of other substances and benefits that come from sun exposure that have nothing to do with vitamin D. And that was a really interesting thing for me because for a long time, I felt like I was kind of banging my head against the wall with people who just wanted to supplement with vitamin D. And then when I learned about this idea of other associated photo products, I was like, okay, so we have a new argument here. We have a new calculus that we're kind of working from. And now more recently, since 2019, 2020, there have actually been studies that have come out around sun exposure independent of vitamin D, how it reduces the risk of colon cancer, breast cancer, non-Hodgkin lymphoma, and even COVID susceptibility and mortality. And that, I don't think that's controversial to say anymore. I think we've got some pretty good literature around it at this point. But actually, just being in the sun, like we know it elevates mood. We know that it is generating vitamin D. We know that vitamin D is really important for the immune system, for protection against a range of diseases, just for overall health in general. And then there's also what you were talking about, which is the circadian rhythm. So that is something I go back to this a lot. Like so much of my career has been about helping people choose nutrient dense and nourishing foods and thinking, if you just get the right nutrients in your body, you're going to be healthy. And the problem with the modern world is that all the food it doesn't have any nutrients in it. And, everything is fake. And then you start to learn more and then you're like, oh, actually, that's not everything. There's also your time outside. There's also your stress. There's also all of these other things. It starts to get a little bit overwhelming, but that's also partially why I don't do just one thing. I talk about all the things because all the things are important. Exercise, sun exposure, sleep, stress, movement, all of that stuff. And I think honestly, where so many of us get caught up is the circadian rhythm stuff. And it's not even just like not making it outside first thing in the morning and grounding and, putting your bare feet on the grass and, letting some light hit your skin and your eyes. Like it's what time we go to bed. It's the blue screens that we're looking at. It's all of that stuff that is sort of manipulating the natural rhythms of our bodies. And I think, the more we get attuned to that and the more little things that we can do to sort of align ourselves with what our bodies are kind of begging us for, which is a more, I don't know, natural rhythm to the day. Like I think that's kind of where the rubber meets the road. So as far as the circadian rhythm goes, and just, I really think a good first step is just being mindful about getting some kind of sun exposure at some point during the day. The earlier, the better, if possible. But then again, throughout the course of the day. And I said like 10 to 15 minutes at midday. That's like a bare minimum, in my opinion. And I am not a dermatologist. I am an investigative writer, an investigative podcaster. And it's really encouraging to me that the scientific literature is actually reflecting that sun exposure is important. But at the same time, note that oftentimes what comes out in the literature is just that like basement bare minimum number
Mhm.
that's hopefully going to keep people from being deficient. That's what the RDA numbers are, your
Right.
recommended daily intake for nutrients. It's bare bones, like to keep you from being deficient. And if you can get out there, I say for me personally, it's almost like the more the better. As long as I don't burn and as long as I'm kind of protecting the parts of myself and my kids that need to be protected more than others, I feel like I'm doing good things for myself.
Mhm.
Roundabout way. I put a long tail on that kite.
I love long tails.
I do too.
I like the nerdiness of like when people dive into stuff too, because
Yeah.
like that's where it makes sense. If somebody's just like, you need to get sun exposure, it's like knowing the behind the scenes, I feel like gives you that motive to actually want to do it. When you
Yeah.
know the benefits, when you know all of that information, it makes you
Yeah.
want to get outside. And I mean, the things with the sun, it's no different. Well, like I said, I need to work on the circadian rhythm, and I'm sure getting more sun exposure too. We planted arborvitaes around our yard, and they're still super small. And
Uh-huh.
my husband and I are like, we can't wait until they're tall so we can just walk around naked in our backyard.
We used to live on a farm and there was nobody for miles and I would just straight up like full on letting it all hang out. Just
Yeah.
it was really cool.
So how much of your skin though needs to be exposed if you're taking that in? Because I know we're going to get into
Yeah.
sun safety, which is kind of covering your skin. So
Yeah.
how much of your skin actually needs to be exposed in order to get some of those benefits?
Well, if we were to have a very not nuanced conversation with no context, I would say all of it. Because, like I
Hmm.
said, every cell in your body, every tissue in your body has vitamin D receptors. So it's beneficial all over the place. But at the same time, it's like we're not cave people. We're not walking around naked all the time. So we've got different areas of the
Right.
body that's, yeah, they're just more, sensitive, burn more easily. Like my stomach gets red really quickly because it's never in the sun. Whereas I feel like my arms never get burned. I
Hmm.
usually don't burn on my face either, which is really interesting. And there are also like the more vanity considerations, of course, because the sun can cause photo aging.
Hmm.
No matter what your approach is. Interestingly, over the like first 30 years of sunscreen even being a thing, melanoma rates skyrocketed. And we'll talk about that as well, how sunscreen can actually really dysregulate your body and cause issues like that. I mean, this is in the scientific papers that are out now, like how they talk about what sunscreen actually did and how it ended up being a really, really bad thing for about 30 years. And then some of the formulations started changing in the late 80s and 90s. So now that has leveled off quite a bit. But even still, some of these studies have pointed out that the the expected benefits of sunscreen use are still not really visible in the data. So it's like sunscreen went from actually being kind of a bad thing to being like neither good nor bad, but not bad anymore. So we can
Hmm.
talk about that too. But I
Yeah.
totally forgot the original question, by the way. This is my mom brain at all times.
Well, I honestly don't know either. So
We're good. How much of the skin and
yes, thank
yeah.
you.
So yeah. So you got to be kind of careful. Like, you can't just lay out for 15 minutes and expect to be fine. Like some people have to start with a few minutes and also really pay attention to what parts of their bodies haven't had a lot of sun exposure that might be more prone to burns very quickly. And that's life limiting, right? It's much better to start gradually. I mean, I know some people say, like, I just burn the first time I go out in the summer and then I'm good for the rest of the summer. I don't love that approach because that will certainly cause skin damage. But, you really do kind of have to gauge, when, where, what parts and all that. But I find when I go out, I like to get a good amount of sun on my legs on both sides. I feel like those are pretty immune to that quick burn. I have to be a little more careful with my back and my stomach because they just don't get as much sun, and then arms. And I try to protect my face just because that's a vanity thing because I'm almost 40.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember hearing all of that about with the skincare, like your face and your dégagé and like
Yeah.
everything, just wanting to protect it from wrinkles.
Yeah.
Um, but so like we've brought up sunscreen like a few times. So there was kind of
Yeah.
a big push and a big boom in the sunscreen world, and kind of the scare from the sun. Like you don't want to be
Yeah.
exposed to the sun. You don't, it causes cancer and all of this. And so sunscreen companies were coming out
Hmm.
huge. And obviously the first ones weren't that great.
Yeah.
Like look at the Great Barrier Reef. Like
Hmm.
it's because of sunscreen that it's dead. And so there's not good ingredients. And so where, I guess kind of where do we find the use of sunscreen
Yeah.
like a good thing and what to look for if that is what we're going to use?
Man, there's so much around this and it's so gratifying to me to talk about it. I hope I don't skip around too much, but I guess I'll start with history. So
Hold on,
these
before you
first
dive into
yeah.
history, I'm going to go grab my daughter quick.
Okay. Do
Okay.
you want me to just go? I can just start talking.
If you want
Or are
to.
you going
No,
to
no, I
splice
want
it
to hear
up?
it so that I
Okay,
can,
you're going to splice it up.
yeah, I'll just grab
Okay,
her quick.
perfect. Okay. So the history around sunscreen is actually really interesting. I don't know that there was any, big hysteria around anything. Maybe there was, and it's not something I've ever really looked into, but it was round about, I think, the 1960s. I know I talked about this in Eat the Yolks, but around the 1960s was when this concept was really first developed. And the entire concept of SPF okay, I'm going to go back. There's two different rays that we talk about when we're talking about sun exposure. There's UVA rays and there's UVB rays. So UVB rays, the B you can think of as burning rays. And we usually think about that as a bad thing, this sunburn. You don't want to get burned because obviously that causes skin damage. And also, if anybody is like me and spent a lot of high school in the tanning beds, you probably went in and they were saying, you should use this bed because we filter out the burning rays. You don't want to burn, you can stay in longer and you can get a deeper tan. So I would do those beds. The ones that don't filter out the burning rays, you can go in for like a minute or 2 minutes, and they're usually a lot cheaper because they require a lot more visits and a lot more work to actually get any kind of tan from. But UVB rays are the ones that burn you. And one of the things that I talk about in Eat the Yolks in my book was like, maybe we need to think of that not necessarily as a bad thing. Yes, getting burned is a bad thing, but these UVB rays are like a signaling ray. They very efficiently tell us when we're about to have too much sun exposure. So you get that little hint of pink, you haven't quite burned yet, but that signal, when you have this unobstructed connection between your body and the sun, those UVB rays are the ones that are signaling to your body when you've had enough. Now, these sunscreens in the 1960s were only formulated to block UVB. So it was like, all right, now I can stay out in the sun all day long without burning. So I'm good. But what these sunscreens did not block was UVA rays. And UVA rays, all of the scientific literature is pretty clear. UVA rays are the ones that are significantly associated with malignant melanoma, with really, really deep DNA damage to the skin. And I can't remember what this study said exactly, but it was something like UVB can cause damage, but UVA finishes the job. UVA is the one that's really causing that really scary stuff that we want to avoid. Well, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, sunscreen did nothing to protect anybody from UVA. This SPF ranking, the sun protection factor, also has nothing to do with UVA rays. It only has to do with the level of protection, quote unquote, that it provides you from the burning rays. And the more we learn, the more we know that that's not necessarily a good thing. I understand why everybody thought it was a good thing, but it turned out to be a huge problem. And in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we see this huge spike in cancers related to sun damage, in malignant melanoma. And this is pretty well understood in the scientific literature. And then around the late 80s and I think the 90s, companies started formulating so-called broad spectrum sunscreens, which is great. Basically, what broad spectrum is a proportion, or at least a greater proportion of the rays that the sunscreens protect against are also UVA. So I think in like Europe, UVA protection has to be at least 1/3 of UVB protection. In the United States, we don't even get close. So you might think, oh, broad spectrum, that sounds great. But really, it's just giving you a little more protection against UVA and still protecting you against a lot of UVB. And the term they're using in the science now is spectral homeostasis. And this is something like I don't do all of my own research. I have an amazing researcher, Amanda Torres, who pulls all of this stuff for me. And my job is to kind of synthesize it and make sense to a layperson like myself, because that's my whole mission here is, trying to learn things that are going to make my life better. But I'm a layperson. I'm just somebody that wants to be well, as best I can. So I feel really lucky that my job involves actually coordinating with scientists that can help me find all of this information. But the idea is spectral homeostasis, which is basically balanced protection against both types of rays. And broad spectrum doesn't do that. Our standards in the United States for sunscreen performance are extremely, extremely low. And that's also, which we'll probably talk about later, factoring into all of these bajillion different, oh, baby, those sounds are so sweet.
My nipple fell out of her mouth.
That's not good. Don't let that happen again.
I
Not a happy baby. My 2-year-old, we're still nursing a little bit. You're a doula, so I imagine you support extended breastfeeding.
I'm still nursing my almost 2-year-old too.
Oh, I love that. That's so great. It's funny though, once they're old enough to actually like say the words like, sit down, nurse. And I'm like, wow, you're 2. You're 2.
I know.
But it's all good.
Yeah. My daughter says, booby, drink, booby, drink. I'm like, oh, get a drink of water. Here's your sippy cup. And she's like, no.
Maybe not now.
Yeah.
Maybe not right now. It has to work for both of us.
Yeah.
So this idea of broad spectrum does not mean that you have uniform protection against both types of rays. So that's, again, like, it's better than what people were using 30, 40 years ago, but it's still not, it's this false sense of security, that word broad spectrum, because really the only thing that can actually give you balanced protection, or maybe another way to look at it, is preserving the proportion of UVA to UVB that you would get naturally, but just attenuating it, just diluting it a little bit so that you're less prone to sustain damage in a shorter period of time. So, so many things in nature, it's a balance. You need that balance between waking and sleeping, or sun exposure and darkness. And it's the same. You need that balance between UVA rays and UVB rays. And UVB rays, in many ways, promote physiology that protects against the damage from UVA. So you really want those rays to be in balance. Nature does that naturally. But when we put on sunscreen, we definitely have a false sense of security around how protected we are from damage. And what you talked about a few minutes ago was the environmental damage. Oxybenzone was the big one that we found out a couple years ago was damaging coral reefs and causing just massive, irreversible environmental disasters. And it makes sense. Like, we're introducing these chemicals into these environments where they're not supposed to be. Like, no surprise, there's unintended consequences. And it's interesting because even, the more conventional brands of sunscreen now are all, maybe it's a Google ranking thing, I don't know what it is, but you go to these websites and it's like oxybenzone free or
Mhm.
whatever it is.
Or
And
like they say reef safe or something.
yes, reef safe. And that's great. And even zinc, gosh, I have so many problems with some of the chemicals that are used in sunscreen that have nothing to do with oxybenzone. The aerosol sunscreens really bother me. And I totally get it. It's so much easier to use a spray sunscreen. But do you ever watch like people applying that stuff on the beach?
It goes everywhere.
90% of it is just diffusing into the environment. It just blows my mind. And I really wish there was a better solution, but the better solution is clothing, just like I said before.
Mhm.
So at this point in the United States, and I don't know why this is, number one, the FDA actually doesn't consider any chemical sunscreen, and that means any sunscreen that is not based around zinc or titanium dioxide. They don't consider any chemical sunscreen safe because of endocrine disruption, absorption and bioaccumulation, which is basically like what you're putting on your skin is getting into your body and causing problems that we don't even know what they are yet. And then endocrine disruption, which is,
Right.
hormone disruption. So that's a big one. And that again says nothing of what these sunscreens are potentially doing to the environment.
Mhm. A
Yeah.
couple of times you said it's like known in scientific literature that this is a
Yeah.
thing,
Yeah.
but it's not known to normal people like me.
No.
So unless you're Googling about sunscreen and you're
Right.
going
Right.
down a rabbit hole, like you wouldn't know that when sunscreen came out, the cancer increased because you're like, oh, I can stay in the sun for hours now, just keep
Yeah.
reapplying sunscreen. And people were thinking that it was something else, like that we actually need more sunscreen to help with
Mm-hmm.
the,
Yeah.
with the protection from cancer.
Sunscreen harder. If it's not working, sunscreen
Right,
harder.
right.
Yeah.
Or that the FDA doesn't approve of it.
Isn't that something you
Like,
were?
I would never know that. Honestly, not that the
Yeah.
FDA approval really means that much to me anyways with some
Right.
things. But the fact, since they approve so many things like in our cosmetics, so many things in our makeup that is horrible for us, but they don't approve
Yes.
of sunscreen, that blows
Yes.
my mind.
When the FDA says something, yeah, see, I'm with you. A lot of my journey around food and wellness had to do with realizing what the government was saying was complete BS.
Right. Or
But
that was
it's,
okay for you to consume. You're like, so it's okay for me to put this thing into my body
well,
that's not.
yes, oxybenzone, avobenzone, all of these chemicals that we're talking about that they're now like, oh, yeah, by the way, we're just going to plop this in this little paper here. Maybe nobody will hear about it. And there's, some dilution of liability there where it's like, oh, it's been 30 years and we don't really know where it came from, but now we're going to do better. It's like, well, okay, way to not take responsibility for anything.
Mhm.
It's really tough. And I feel like when the FDA says something is safe and then reverses course, that kind of, at the very least, that sends some alarm bells up. And a lot of my professional life, I talk to people who don't believe me. And so bringing that to them as a starting point, being like, well, the FDA doesn't even consider this to be safe. that will sometimes kind of like crack it open a little bit, crack open the
Mm-hmm.
conversation, open the door a little bit. But it's also, I don't know if this is a good or a bad thing. I know that our regulations for approval of SPF products, I mean, it's impossible. It's like literally standstill. And that skeptic in me is like, well, maybe that's not a bad thing because you see that almost every sunscreen brand is now attempting to innovate with zinc, with like safer, like what we know to be kind of barrier products. We probably should have gone over this before, and I'm sorry, I bounce around, but when you're looking at sunscreen, you've got basically what are chemical sunscreens, which are meant to like scatter or absorb UV rays. And then you've got the physical, like mineral sunscreens that actually block UV rays, at least to a degree, not enough to reach spectral homeostasis, but they do a better job of protect, or they do a good job of protecting, but clothing again does the best possible job. So you can kind of think of these mineral zinc titanium dioxide sunscreens as these physical mineral sunscreens that are actually blocking UV rays similar to how clothing would. It's a physical barrier. And the it's either the FDA or whatever the approving organization in the United States is, it is so difficult to get a new product or a new ingredient approved for sun protection that basically the option that companies seem to have, or at least from my perspective, is just innovating with different types of zinc. So now we have nanoparticle zinc in sunscreens that kind of reduce the white cast when you put it on. You have all these different formulations, but like all of them contain zinc. And I don't know that that's 100% because zinc is the best option we have. My suspicious nature tends to say, like, we don't need more chemicals to find out 30 years down the road that it's destroying the
Something
ocean
else.
or
Yeah.
something else, or, ruining your lymphatic system or whatever. So I like that zinc is the thing. And part of that, it doesn't have to do with the industry believing that it's the end all be all. It has more to do with them being not allowed to innovate because of the regulations in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. Um, I guess like, cause I follow a lot of people who post more natural things. Like
Mhm.
I was researching sunscreen for the summer. I'd like to try to not use it, but there's probably going to be times where I need
Yeah.
to.
Yeah.
And just trying to find a good one that I feel okay with putting on my kid's skin. And
Yeah.
I don't know what I'm reading on the back of labels of things at all, like ever. I'm like, I don't know what this is. I don't know if it's okay. I don't know
There's
what it's
just
not.
so many things. We need
Right.
a QR code that will bring up
Oh my
every
gosh.
single one. Let's invent that.
Right. Write
Yeah.
it down right now.
Yeah. Write it down because I'm gonna
um,
forget.
well, because there's like a couple people that I follow that I respect their opinions, and one of them, she used to be the non-toxic munchkin, and now she goes by
Hmm.
Three Little Plums. Whenever
Yeah.
I'm like
Yeah.
googling stuff for kids, I always go to her
Yeah.
page. She came on the podcast and she's awesome, and she's all about toxic free living. And
Yeah.
so I'm like, wait, what does she recommend for this? Because I do not know what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
But I still haven't bought any because I'm like, I don't know what to do. So like, when would sunscreen be appropriate? And then what are we potentially looking for in it?
So in my house, we use in general for the kids Badger Balm, which the ingredients for that are like zinc, sunflower oil, vitamin E. I mean, all of it is readable and digestible, and you basically know what it is. It's, in my opinion, it's the best, probably least toxic option. However, the other sort of wild card with sunscreen is whether you're applying it properly. And
Mm.
that's really tough because if you're in and out of the water, if the kid, my daughter will wipe her eyes when she gets out of the water and then she'll wipe off all of the sunscreen that I put on her cheeks and nose. So it is really frustrating. And especially if your kid refuses to wear a hat, you
Mhm.
really have to figure out a way to protect their skin. And I don't know that there is a perfect solution. I think that's just the fact that you have to figure out a way to balance sun exposure and what you want to do, how you want to play outside, you want to have a beach day with what the skin is actually telling you. And that's hard. So we send my older daughter, she's 7, to a summer camp, and they're outside all day long. So I send her with Badger Balm all over her face. I make sure she wears a rash guard for all water activities. And I ask her to wear a hat all day. And that's really, I think, the best we can do. With little babies, they'll often wear a hat. So you don't need to worry as much about their sun exposure on their faces. And, you have more control over that. But the sunscreens that actually offer the best protection against rays, and again, this can be manipulated by whether you're in and out of the water, whether you're sweating, all of that stuff. That's just the reality of it. But the best sunscreens are the highest level, the highest percentage of zinc oxide, and then a couple other simple ingredients to keep it in solution. 25% is the level of zinc that is required for spectral homeostasis. It is extremely thick, white, pasty, like diaper cream, basically sunscreen. And a lot of adults don't want to do that. And I get it. But we just have to be realistic and say, you might have to compromise. You might have to look like a total dork at the beach and just be, covered in white goo on your nose and cheeks, and just wear a rash guard and deal with it. So I like Badger Balm. I like anything that's just a thick, basic zinc for being non-toxic, for approaching balanced protection, UVA to UVB, spectral homeostasis, and also for just looking like a jackass.
Yeah. Like a ghost.
Pretty much. And kids, I mean, kids don't care, right? I smear it all over my kids' faces, and it actually helps me know when they need to be, reapplied, because I can't see it, on their cheeks and nose anymore. But we've already dealt with a little bit of a burn. It's just hard. It's hard to keep kids accountable for that stuff. The sticks are really good. And this is something that I harped on for a while, which was liking the sticks better than the lotions, because one of the issues with lotions is that the zinc can separate out of the solution. Now, if you have eyes and you're paying attention, you should be able to see when that's happening. But I think a lot of people just don't know that. There was a lawsuit many years ago against the Honest Company about people burning when they use their zinc sunscreen. And I think what it turned out, I might be completely misspeaking, but I think what it turned out was that the zinc had separated from the other ingredients in the solution, and people were basically just applying like sunflower oil with a little bit of zinc in it. So you do have to pay attention to that. And zinc sticks are easier for kids to use anyway. So
yeah. So basically, if they're going to be outside all day and not seeking shade.
Yeah. It's just white paste all over and a rash guard.
Yeah.
That's the safest. That is the least toxic, the safest way to go. There are other things you can do. You can use like less ideal sunscreen in a pinch, because in the end, if you're going to be outside all day, one day, using something that's less ideal just to avoid that burn might be like the compromise that you want to make. But at the same time, day after day after day, I don't think it's a good idea. So I think for overall health, modifying how we actually approach the sun and how we structure our lives around it and getting used to that is probably the best way to go, because that'll serve us long term.
Yeah. I love that, because I feel like you're still, I don't know, we need to have a healthy relationship with nature. And that's kind of finding that healthy relationship with the sun. Like, it's there to nourish us, to actually give us life. But we have to respect the sun as well. And I know, I feel like it'll be easy, obviously, the stage that I'm in with my oldest, because she'll be 2 in September, and she is like white. She's blonde hair, blue-eyed, like almost translucent. So if we are out in the sun, she starts to get red and flushed before she would ever get burned. Like, if my husband gives her kisses on her cheeks, he has a beard, she gets really red and bumpy, and then it like goes away. Like, her skin is so sensitive to anything. And so, like, we were outside the other day and she was turning red, and my mother-in-law asked, she's like, "Oh, is she getting burned?" I'm like, "She's just really hot. Like, you have to like put ice packs on this girl. If she starts to get a little warm, she's flushed." So it's easy to give her shade breaks at the age she's at. even if she doesn't want to go inside, like I could be like, well, you are,
Yeah.
or whatever.
Yeah.
But she does not, she was fighting putting on a hat the other day, and I can't like walk around and hold it onto her head.
I know. That's the frustrating thing.
Mm-hmm.
When
So
they know
I'm
what they
like,
want and they aren't going to go with anything else. Sorry, mom.
right. Well, and you want them to be independent. You want them to
Yeah.
foster those skills, but you also want to teach them that we're here to love and protect them.
Another thing that I've been working on with my 7-year-old, and I'm not perfect about it, but is just kind of teaching her that this is your amazing body. Like you and we need to nurture our children's ability to pay attention and take care of their bodies. So maybe I don't think she applies her zinc sunscreen perfectly and I can kind of follow up and fill in some spots, but it has been a really good thing for us to involve our kids in putting on the sunscreen stick and kind of guiding that and letting them be a part of that process because I want them to be vigilant too. I want them to be thinking about these things.
Hmm. Yeah. So with your kids, then, do you do 15 minutes without the sunscreen
Pretty much.
or
And,
whatever?
I let that creep up over the course of the summer. And again, I know I'm not making any friends of dermatologists, but at the same time, you were talking about this with your episode with Dr. Stu, where it's something like, or maybe you were literally just saying it in this episode, and I just can't remember where I was hearing you say it. Pardon me if that's the case, but that it can take 20 years
Yeah,
for,
that was a past episode.
okay,
But
that
even
must have been with
longer in
Dr.
other
Stu.
things. I mean, I'm getting ready to talk about eating and drinking during labor, and like the
Hmm.
guidance around that is based from the 1940s, and they did a
Oh my
study in the
God.
90s showing that like that people don't aspirate anymore because we're not going under general anesthesia. And I'm
Uh-huh.
like, okay, like when are people going to change this? Because I was just at a birth last week where they told her she couldn't even drink. They said you can have ice chips. And I'm like,
Oh, can you
this is
imagine?
such outdated information, like just being so frustrated because it's not, and like research shows that
Yeah.
it's okay. So like we have to wait how long? Like this has been in the research for over 20 years now.
Right.
So it's, but yeah, these things, the findings, like you keep saying scientific literature shows, and it's like, okay, well, when's that
When's that
actually
going to
going to come
trickle
out?
down? Yeah. When is it going to A, reach all of the, major licensing, certifying, organizations and then trickle back down to clinicians? It's like you either have to find somebody that actually keeps track of the scientific literature or you have to wait 17. I think there's a study about this that literally said it takes 17 years for scientific knowledge to be translated into practice.
Hmm.
This is a known phenomenon and yet nobody seems to care.
Mm-hmm.
It's extraordinary to me.
They don't
It's
care if you're like, this is
mind-boggling.
what the literature says. They're
No,
like, I don't care until 17
literally.
years from now. And then,
Yes. Let me come back in 17 years. Let me know how you're doing. And
right.
then, yeah, I'll be retired
Mm-hmm.
by then. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's just so unfortunate. So what I do with my little tiny baby, well, she's not little tiny anymore, but my 2-year-old is, and I will actually, this is another thing, little girls, right? We put them in bathing suits that cover sometimes a lot more of their bodies. I guess, little boys will often have like a swim trunk. So that covers more of their legs, but in general, legs, just by the way we move through the world, get a little bit less exposure. But I will put my 7-year-old doesn't let me do this anymore, but we would just do little briefs. So I would let her actually get sun on her belly and on her back, as well as on her arms and all of that for 10, 15 minutes, maybe a little bit more as the summer goes on, as she gets some, we haven't even talked about melanin, which is your body's like natural protective factor that it generates in response to the sun's rays, because the body is really wicked smart.
Mm-hmm.
And the more you're exposed, the more melanin your body will produce to protect you from sun damage. It's pretty amazing. But over the summer, I will let her stay out a little bit longer, just over time. And then I will smear, some thick white paste on her face and put a rash guard and a hat on her, which she won't keep on anymore. But in general, that's kind of, I'm not big on like the little skimpy bikinis for little girls, but I have actually let my 7-year-old wear a 2-piece because I was just thinking it would be good for her to get a little bit of sun on her belly and back, as well as, the rest of her body. So That's
Mhm.
the way we do it in my house. And again, we live at a lake. We have a little beach right around the corner. So this is an everyday thing for me. And I think maybe that might make it easier. I know some folks who like go to the beach once a year or aren't outside that much, or maybe go to the pool
Right.
once a week, might have to be a little bit more vigilant about avoiding that burn. But for us, it's kind of a cumulative approach.
Yeah. I know we're planning a trip to Mexico in December, so
Mm,
that'll be interesting because I mean,
yeah.
it'll be different sun exposure too, not what we're used to. And then it's
Yeah.
like starting our winter, so we will not have been outside as much.
Yes.
Um, at least not exposing as much of our skin outside.
Yeah.
Um, so it'll be good. It'll be nice. Just have to figure it out. Hopefully my daughter will keep a hat on. We'll see.
Well, you've got time to work on that, train that behavior.
Yes. Well, and I have a question about I had a nip slip situation again. um, a question about, so my daughter now, who's almost 4 months, I remember reading somewhere that sun exposure for that age isn't safe at all. And I'm like, that can't be true. Like, cause I mean, they even say like if they have jaundice, right, put them in a
Yeah.
window or whatever. So
Yeah, they
what
put
would,
them under the billy lights. Yeah.
right, right. So for, hold on. Okay. So for my daughter now, like what would be safe sun exposure in
Yeah.
infants?
So you're nursing
Mhm.
as I can see, and this is another one where you really have to consider context and the nuance of the situation. How is your baby getting vitamin D? Are you getting enough sun? Are your vitamin D levels high enough that you're passing along vitamin D to her in your breast milk? Well, then she's getting her vitamin D. Other than that, I think her being outside is a really great idea. But when my second, which I had her 2 years ago, when she was really little, we would be outside all the time, but in general, just in the shade because I knew she
Mhm.
was getting vitamin D. I knew just being outside carried a ton of additional benefits, sensory benefits, physiological benefits, all of that. But to me, I just didn't think I needed to expose her to the sun, especially during the summer. She was born in July because it's so hot and they can't discharge heat as effectively as an
Mhm.
older kid with more surface area. So that's kind of my calculus for that type of decision. Of where is the baby's vitamin D coming from? Are they getting outside enough, shaded, keeping their body temperature at appropriate levels and all of that. So that's how I would manage that type of a thing. And as they get older, and a little bit more autonomous and you're able to read their signs a little bit more, then, actually being in the sun, I think is a great idea. But it is important to think about where are they getting their vitamin D from? Vitamin D is not the only important thing when it comes to the sun, but for little tiny babies, that's probably the big one.
The big thing now too, though, is supplementing. I know,
Yeah.
like since I had my oldest, they talked about supplementing with the vitamin D drops.
Yeah. Do you, as a doula, do you make recommendations around that?
No, no,
Yeah.
I don't. I only kind of pass on what I hear, and a lot of times it's if you're taking in a decent amount, they
Yeah.
should get it through the breast milk.
Yeah.
Um, but I mean, I'm not really versed. If people ask me what I'm doing, I'll share, but I'm
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
obviously it's not medical advice.
Yeah. I mean, I know they quote unquote, they know, and I love the evidence-based birth, website and collection of
Hmm.
information. And they reflected that as well. Like they think that this quote unquote studies show that it's what like mom needs to supplement with 6,400 IU of vitamin D in order to pass the appropriate amount through breast milk. And I
Hmm.
think that's a fine strategy. Like sometimes applying these broad, like with a broad brush to situations that are so individual, it's kind of that pitfall of like modern medicine, right? Is that you're managing bajillions of people with the same standards that maybe don't necessarily apply, but you're just trying to avoid that baseline of deficiency. And so I did that for a while just because I felt like I'd rather supplement myself and make sure that she was okay that way versus actually directly supplementing an infant. So that's what I was comfortable with. I don't know, I don't know if we had a third if I would even do that. I think it would depend on the season. I think it would depend on my vitamin D levels and all of that. So
Hmm.
it's context, it's nuance, and that sucks. I hate it. I hate that everything is so individual, but it is. It is.
Yeah. I know. I have the drops. I just haven't always been good at giving them.
Yeah.
Um, we got really sick a couple months ago. So during that time, I was
Hmm.
making sure they were taking drops every day and doing some other supplements.
Yeah.
But I mean, even now I'm still nursing my oldest. So I'm not too worried about some of that. So
Yeah.
some days I'll be like, oh, I'll give her a drop of vitamin D
Give a
today.
little extra.
Like,
Well, I think that makes sense too. I think it makes sense that our exposure to the sun would be varied. I mean, what did
right.
cavemen do when it was cloudy and rainy or whatever? I think there's just a natural variation to life in nature, like you were talking about.
Yeah. And I've personally been just trying to, I've been somebody who's taken so many supplements so many times.
Me too.
Um, like, and my husband's like, our supplement cupboard's out of control.
We have
And
a whole supplement fridge at this
right.
point. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's some things that I think are really important depending on like what season of life I'm in and kind of what I'm trying to focus on. Um, and but also just really trying to eat more nutritional value, the
Hmm.
nutrient dense foods,
Hmm.
which I haven't been as great at as I once was. And yeah, I mean, that's a whole other topic, like with nutrients being depleted in soil and different
Yeah.
things like that, and what are the normal levels. And I've never gotten like mineral tested or anything like that. So I'm not sure what I would even need. And just kind of not trying to take a gazillion supplements every single
Yeah.
day is
I feel like
what
that's
I'm
a
trying to
really
focus on.
quick way to get yourself way out of balance is to, take, for example, a bunch of one nutrient in isolation. And I did that at one point, during like the height of COVID. I was so, freaked out. I was pregnant. So there were a million things on my mind when everything kind of shut down. And I started taking probably way too much vitamin D.
Mhm.
And the good thing about that is when you stop, you can
Yeah.
kind of reverse that really quickly. But, I was taking this form of vitamin D that had some research around it as being a little bit quicker to basically hit your system. It's called calcifediol. So it's not cholecalciferol, it's calcifediol. And there's like one company that sells it. And I can't even remember what it's called, Ampli-D or something like that. And I was taking way too much of it. And I actually started to experience some symptoms of vitamin D overload. And I was
Mm.
like, oh man, like this is not a good thing. And this is why I kind of like herbs.
Mhm.
I don't do a ton of herbs, but the idea of like tinctures and herbal formulations where you're kind of using these natural things just kind of in concentrated versions to impact the body rather than one nutrient in isolation. It's just, I
Yeah.
mean, it's hard. And
Mhm.
there's nutritional approaches too to protecting your skin from the sun, which I think is great. But in general, I think if you have like a nutrient rich diet that has a good antioxidant content and low polyunsaturated fat content, so like kicking the canola oil, the quote vegetable oils, which are not vegetables, they're grains like corn oil.
Yeah.
Corn is a grain, soybean oil, soy is a legume, like ditching the oils like that are really unstable that cause oxidative damage, eliminating those and just having an antioxidant rich diet can also, I think, help your skin be a little more resilient to sun damage.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, that's really good information. And I feel like you're somebody that I could talk to on so many different topics. I feel like we could go on a gazillion tangents. So
I
I'm
love
sure
that.
I'll have you back on the podcast because
Absolutely.
I really enjoy talking with you. And I know, like I said, there's a million other things that we could talk about. But I mean, just even with the supplementation, just kind of talking about like life kind of ebbs and flows. And that's why I enjoyed this conversation because I feel like it's really hard when people are like, just take this one thing or just do this, you have to take
Yes.
this supplement or you have to do this one thing. And everything's kind of all or nothing. And that's why, like I said, I just enjoyed this conversation because it's like, we do need things from the sun. There's so many benefits.
Yes.
Uh, but there is a time where we do need some protection and just doing the best that you can, taking the information that we have. Nothing's going to be perfect right now. Because we don't have the tools to make everything perfect. Like you
Right.
said, you don't know everything about zinc. So, but that's kind of what we have. And so we're doing our best with what we have. And I
Yeah.
think that that's kind of the important message with everything. But I know that I need to work on doing some more sun exposure. I think one great way would be just in the morning going out with my oldest. We usually walk out barefoot to the garden and like water it. And by that time, she's usually ripped her diaper off. So she's naked anyways. So, but the other day I was like, I'm going to do it in the evenings because it's just easier when she's already in bed. And I'm like, I can do this by myself. I can pick some weeds, do whatever. And I'm not like, we don't have a fence. So I'm not like, hey, don't run in the street.
Yes.
But I'm like, okay, I should do it in the morning with her. So then we're barefoot in the grass, we're in the sun, we're getting all of that. But I
and
need
pat
to
yourself on the back,
that.
like any day you actually accomplish that, just like feel good about it. Cause it might be like one day out of the week, but you got it done. And that's a good thing. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Where can people find and follow you and learn more about everything that you are doing?
Well, thank you so much for having me. This was really exciting. And I'm most active on Instagram at Real Food Liz. And you can also find my book, Eat the Yolks, at eattheyolks.com. And I have a podcast called Liz Talks. So maybe you can come on my podcast next.
I would love to. All right. I will have all of that information in the show notes.